Good morning. Happy to see you here on this beautiful day. Rain for us is a blessing in Ojai. This is what as Yap said this morning, 32 years we have had these gatherings. This is a special one this year. It's Krishnamurti's birthday. And I'm so delighted that I was asked to introduce the speaker this morning because Siddhartha Menon is a very old friend. Siddhartha has come from India to speak to you this morning. He has a long association and affiliation with Krishnamurti and the Krishnamurti work in India. First, he was a student at Rishi Valley School. And after his formal education, he returned to the school more than 25 years ago as a teacher. He taught math and English, and also as headmaster. So he's deeply embedded in the Rishi Valley School and the whole culture of the school. I've heard him speak. He's a very, very fine speaker. You're in for a very great treat this morning. Siddhartha also has the qualification of being a poet. And I think poets bring a special sensibility. And you will sense that this morning in what he's going to say. So please let us welcome Siddhartha Menon.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Mark, for that extremely generous introduction. I'm not sure if you're in for a treat, but I'd like to share some things with you. Apologies for this thing that stands between us. I have several papers, formidable sheaf of papers, because I have a few things that I'd like to read out to you. And it's also useful to have something to hide behind. Thank you also to the KFA for giving me this opportunity. I can't tell you how happy I am to be here. I feel very much at home in Ojai, as I do in the other Krishnamurti centers, even if I haven't lived there for a long time. And this is a particularly inspiring space, and today is an inspiring day. I did not recall that it was Krishnamurti's birthday, but in Rishi Valley too, we'll take any rain we get, regardless of what its effects are. Insights into education is the theme of this gathering. and I don't know if I can really offer any insights into education. However, I have questions and some thoughts on those questions, and that's what I'd like to share. As Mark mentioned, I've been with Rishi Valley or another Krishnamurti school for quite a long time. And these schools, including of course the Oak Grove School here in Ojai, I would say increasingly in the public eye, and for good reasons. They're generally well thought of, and people who are looking for something valuable in education are choosing to send their children to these schools. It's now more than 30 years since Krishnamurti passed away. And the question for somebody like me who's working in one of these schools and has been for a while is, what is it that he has given us in the area of education? And in what ways are we able to keep what he's given us meaningful and alive? Yap mentioned in the introduction that, I don't know where he got the figure, but something like 60%, perhaps it was an approximation, of Krishnamurti's writings and words have been in one way or the other linked to education. Now that's really interesting, because I think Krishnamurti doesn't fit into any standard definition of an educationist, if there is one. He was not systematic in laying down guidelines for curricula or even exploring different stages in a child's development and so on and so forth. And yet he set up schools. He set up schools, he did not set up ashrams. And as Yap mentioned, he spent a lot of time engaging with people who were in the work of education. So it was very central to, let us say, his mission, for want of a better word. And so the question is, what is it, as I said, as I asked earlier, that he's given us? And what is it that we're holding? I'd like to, at the start of this talk, evoke a river, and at the end of the talk, evoke a tree. Now, rivers and trees, like rocks, mountains, lakes, and many other things, often found their way into Krishnamurti's thinking and writing. He was, as we all know, deeply connected with the natural world and felt it was so important. Now, last year, for some time, I happened to spend a few weeks at Rajghat. For those of you who don't know, Rajghat, like Rishi Valley, is one of the oldest Krishnamurti schools. It's set up in Varanasi, in northern India, and it's along the banks of the river Ganga, which is quite broad and beautiful at that point. And one day, in fact, throughout my stay there, whenever I walked along the river, when I stopped to look at it closely, I sometimes found myself puzzled by the movement of the river. I knew as I was looking at the river from my knowledge of geography that the river was flowing roughly eastwards, northeastwards at that point, and therefore from right to left. But if I looked at the water, it seemed to be flowing in exactly the opposite direction. And that was strange. And I realized, of course, that that was because the wind was blowing in that direction, so it looked as if the wavelets were blowing against the flow. So were there any signs at all of which way the flow itself was? And if I look closely, I could in fact see that the river was flowing as it should, from right to left, because of objects on the water. There were tree trunks and other miscellaneous things, and you could see that they were flowing in the way I would have expected them to, although the river itself seemed to be flowing in the opposite direction. So there was what you might call an outer flow, the surface flow, an outer movement, if you like, and an inner one, and they seemed to be going in different directions, and it took some effort to see that both of them were really part of one movement. But of course there were times in my stay there when I found I just wasn't aware of the river at all. I wasn't even looking at it, or I was looking at it, but my mind was preoccupied, and I was seeing neither an outer nor an inner movement. Now, it seems to me that Krishnamurti was deeply concerned with what you might call an outer movement, and with looking at it, but with also looking at what you might call an inner movement. And equally, I would say, with not looking, with not noticing. And I think in a lot of his thought and writing, he evokes these movements and the fact that we sometimes don't see the movements at all. And I'd like to use that as a starting point, and I'll keep referencing it at different points during this talk. One of my memories from when I was a student at Rishi Valley, at that time Krishnamurti was still alive, and he'd spent several weeks in Rishi Valley. He talked to students. And I can't claim to have been a particularly attentive listener at that time. I'm not sure how much the questions he was raising mattered to me then. But I do know that a few things stayed with me. And especially, I think Krishnamurti had a gift for communicating with children. And he was able to use metaphors or very concrete ideas in a way in which children could connect with them. And I remember once, in fact more than once, his asking all of us, "Can you look at a tree?" And that would be followed by a further question, and that was the intriguing one. Can you look at a tree without naming it, without labeling it, without saying anything about it? Can you just look at a tree? And the question struck me because I had never thought about it. I think I'd taken looking at trees for granted. And I remember trying very hard to look at a tree without having any thoughts about it. And of course I couldn't do it. And later on, I found that Krishnamurti had asked this question in his writing as well. And so let me read you one place where he asks this question, and this is in Freedom from the Known. He says, "It seems to me that one of our greatest difficulties is to see for ourselves really clearly not only outward things but inward life. When we say we see a tree or a flower or a person, do we actually see them? Or do we merely see the image that the word has created? Have you ever experimented with looking at an objective thing like a tree without any of the associations, any of the knowledge you've acquired about it? Without any prejudice, any judgment, any words forming a screen between you and the tree and preventing you from seeing it as it actually is?" So this was the question that he asked. And in this passage which I just read, he says at the beginning, "It seems to me that one of our greatest difficulties is to see for ourselves and so on. And that I discovered at first hand, that it was really difficult to look at something without all kinds of thought processes coming into it. But as I stayed with this question over the years and went back to Rishi Valley and was teaching there, a further question became increasingly important for me, which was why? One is, can you look at a tree, but also why? What was so important about being able to look at a tree without judgment and so on? Now, in this passage I was reading, he goes on, and here there's something like an answer to the question why. He says, try it and see what actually takes place when you observe the tree with all your being, with the totality of your energy. In that intensity, you will find that there is no observer at all. There's only attention. When you're looking at something with complete attention, there is no space for a conception, a formula, or a memory. Now that seems self-evident, especially when you've been engaging with Krishnamurti for some time. He comes back to this over and over, to be able to look at something without judgment, without the hold of memory, to be in a state of attention. And this has something to do with the way we look at both the outer movement, the outer thing, the tree, if you will, as well as the inner. Now, one question which I'd like to share with you at this stage, and it's been important for me, is, does Krishnamurti privilege one looking over the other? Does he privilege looking at the outer over looking at the inner, or vice versa? Is he, for instance, I mean, it's tempting to think this. I teach literature, and you know, when you're teaching literature, you're dealing with metaphor all the time, and so you know, you can't help asking yourself, you know, when Krishnamurti was saying, can you look at a tree, is he actually concerned with, not really with the tree, but with looking inward, and is he raising the question of the tree merely as a kind of entry, as a sort of metaphor, and so on. And so I was grappling with this question for a bit, and I'd like to draw an analogy here, and this is from poetry, if you'll excuse me. There's a wonderful poem by the English poet Ted Hughes called The Thought Fox. And in the poem The Thought Fox, Hughes begins and ends the poem with himself alone in a room. At the beginning of the poem, he's sitting there with a blank sheet of paper. By the end of the poem, the page is printed, the poem is being written. And in between, he describes a fox moving through a forest, through a wood, gently, and entering what he calls the dark hole of the head. And in discussions with students about this poem, one question which often arises is the poem about thought and the arising of a thought, or is the poem about a fox? And usually, at some point, we seem to agree that the poem is equally about both. It's not about one more than the other. It's not that the fox is a metaphor for thought, or that thought is a metaphor for a fox. Both are equally the subject of the poem. And I'd like to think the same is true about inward and outward movements. I think Krishnamurti was equally concerned with both. And I think he truly saw it as one movement. I don't think he saw one as being lesser than the other. In fact, if you look at his writings, he seems to move easily between the two. One of the books over the years that I have found deeply compelling is this series of writings that came to be called commentaries on living. And if you look at the passages there which describe encounters that Krishnamurti has with several people, miscellaneous people who come typically to meet him with something they want to discuss, many of those passages begin with descriptions that seem to be unconnected with the encounter that is to follow. You'll have a landscape described, a room described at great length. And these descriptions are important in themselves. And I've often asked myself why these commentaries are structured in this way. I think it has to do with establishing a certain kind of what he calls attention, which can happen through close looking at anything, whether it's inward or outward. Anyway, as I said, I think that Krishnamurti doesn't privilege one over the other. In fact, he moves easily between the two. And to illustrate this, I'd like to read you two parallel passages from another of the books that I find myself going back to quite often. And that's this wonderful compilation called Krishnamurti on Education, where there's a series of discussions with students followed by a series of discussions with teachers, sometimes on the same theme. And the two passages I'm going to read you are one each from the section on students and from the section on teachers, section with teachers, both on the theme of fear. In the first one, he's talking to a student, and in the course of the conversation, towards the end of the conversation, Krishnamurti starts describing what he calls meditation is. And remember, he's talking to a student here, and as you'll see, he goes quite deep into this whole process of looking at oneself. And I think it's worth listening to a fair amount of it, because that gives you a sense of how he goes very systematically into it with a child in a school. He says, first of all, sit very quietly. Do not force yourself to sit quietly, but sit or lie down quietly without force of any kind. Do you understand? Then watch your thinking. Watch what you are thinking about. You find you're thinking about your shoes, your saris, what you're going to say, the bird outside to which you listen. Follow such thoughts and inquire why each thought arises. Do not try to change your thinking. See why certain thoughts arise in your mind so that you begin to understand the meaning of every thought and every feeling without any enforcement. And when a thought arises, do not condemn it, do not say it is right, it is wrong, it is good, it is bad. Just watch it, so that you begin to have a perception, a consciousness which is active in seeing every kind of thought, every kind of feeling. When you go into thought very, very deeply, your mind becomes extraordinarily subtle, alive. No part of the mind is asleep, the mind is completely awake. And then he says, that is merely the foundation. Then your mind is very quiet, your whole being becomes very still, then go through that stillness deeper, further. This whole process is meditation. To understand the whole process of your thinking and feeling is to be free from all thought, to be free from all feeling, so that your mind, your whole being becomes very quiet. And that is also, and this is really what I want to draw your attention to is even more, and that is also part of life. And with that quietness, you can look at the tree. You can look at at people. You can look at the sky and the stars. That is the beauty of life. So you see in this passage how he goes quite deeply, quite systematically into the stages of quietening your mind, looking inward, entering into a state of meditation. But at the end, there's the looking at the tree and at life outside. And he says it can only happen when this has happened or through this process. And he ends with what he calls the beauty of life. Now the second passage, the parallel passage, which is in the conversation with a teacher, is very interesting because you see something similar. And here he's talking to a teacher and he asks the teacher, how do we set about to help the student actually to be free from fear? This is the question. And the teacher gives a number of responses, says a number of things that I find myself saying as well. He says, the teacher talks, I'm not going to read it all out. He says, I would first establish a good relationship with the child so that the child feels comfortable with me. Then he says, I would evoke curiosity in the student so that the student wants to look at this whole question of fear. Then the teacher even says, I will take the student through a process of meditation, very like the one that Krishnamurti has described. But in spite of all this, Krishnamurti remains unsatisfied. He says, yes, you'll do this, but what else? Yes, meditation, the mind is silent, but now what? And then, this is what he says. He says, you've so far dealt with the movement of the mind. The tide is moving in, the tide also moves out. If it remains inward, it is like the backwaters of a bay, but if the tide has a movement inward, then it has to have an outward movement. You've dealt so far only with an inward movement. How will you help the student to move out? And he goes on, you only talk of the inner movement, but it is a movement of the tide both inward and outward. It is a movement you've created in one direction, and you do not know how to treat the inner and the outer as one movement. And finally, he ends, there are hills, trees, the river, the sands. That is the outward movement. The perception, the seeing, that is the outward movement. Nature has provided you with the beauty of all this, the rivers, trees, the arid land. So there has to be movement both outward and inward, the everlasting movement. So if you noticed, towards the end of both of these passages, Krishnamurti uses the word beauty or refers to beauty. And in both of them he evokes trees, the river, and so on, the things which we would consider beautiful. And of course Krishnamurti was intensely sensitive to beauty, and there was a strong aesthetic quality to the way he regarded beauty. And I think that's one of the reasons perhaps that the different Krishnamurti centers, school study centers and so on are all set in wonderful places. I mean, if you have to learn about looking, it helps to be in a place where you're looking at something you'd like to look at and you're surrounded by beauty. But I think Krishnamurti's connection with beauty was not only an aesthetic one. I think it also had to do with staying with reality. You know, somewhat in the Keatsian sense, Keats in his poem Ode on a Grecian Urn, the final message of the urn is beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know. So I think for Krishnamurti, beauty also lay in staying with the fact, with what he called truth. It wasn't merely an aesthetic principle. It had to do with not moving away from reality. And so, this brings me to another question that I remember from the time I was a student at Rishi Valley. He would sometimes ask students, he would sometimes ask us, do you see the reality of things around you? And not just trees, but the reality of suffering, difficulty, and so on. To give you one instance that I remember, he asked once, do you see those children from the villages nearby? Rishi Valley is surrounded by villages which are inhabited by subsistence farmers. And I'm talking about the 1980s. He would ask, do you see those children? You know, these children walk 6 miles each way to school barefoot. Do you see them? And then he would ask a further question. He would say, what will you do about it? What is your responsibility? He didn't ask it that way. He said, what will you do about it? So both recognizing the reality of things around and then putting upon you the responsibility to act was also part of his engagement, I think, with children in the schools. I think it was one aspect of, this statement of his, which is often quoted, you are the world. In other words, both you're no different from the rest of the world and you're responsible for the world. And I think it was very important for him that people came in touch with this truth. However, of course, there's a very strong human tendency to look away, to not want to see reality for various reasons. And when I say not want to see reality, to not want to see the reality of the world around, because there are things happening in the world which are not pleasant to see, but also not wanting to see the reality of the world within, because the reality includes things we perhaps rather hide from ourselves, the various urges, conflicts, and so on. I don't need to spell them out. And I think Krishnamurti was very concerned with this too. Looking Away is in fact the title of a book which came out a few years ago by an Indian, I would say, commentator. He was a former civil servant, and now he is a person who works a great deal in society on human rights issues, on education for deprived children, and so on. His name is Harsh Mandar, and his book, Looking Away, is partly about the realities of poverty and inequality in India, also of prejudice in India, the way minorities are treated. But more than anything else, his book is about the very widely prevalent tendency to look away, for India's vast middle classes to ignore the suffering they see around them. I don't know if that's true of life in the US as well, but in India it's certainly very obvious. You live surrounded by misery, by poverty, and perhaps one of the coping mechanisms of dealing with it, although that might sound, is to ignore it. So his book is about that as well. And he quotes Elie Wiesel, who says that something like this, the opposite of love is not hate, the opposite of love is indifference. And indifference also arising from choosing not to see the reality of suffering and so on and so forth. He also quotes, and I'd like to share this quote with you because I find it very interesting. He quotes Martin Luther King, who says society's punishments are small compared to the wounds we inflict on our souls when we look away. Now, I find this very meaningful because I think what King recognizes here is that to look away is not merely an act of irresponsibility in terms of what that implies for our lack of engagement with suffering and so on, but it's also self-damaging. It's also in some way diminishing your own human potential. And I think this comes very close to what Krishnamurti was talking about. To not look, whether to look out or to look in, is to stunt something. Now this brings me then to education and the Krishnamurti schools. I think the centrality of this process of looking, this process of attention to whatever is, whether it's outside or inside, informs a lot of the educational work of the Krishnamurti schools. At least that I think would certainly be the intention. Now there's no formula for this, and therefore there's no blueprint for a Krishnamurti school. Now if you look at the schools, there are 8 of them, 6 in India. There's the Oak Grove School and there's Brockwood Park in England. The schools have evolved quite differently. Each has a distinct identity. And yet I would say that there are some practices in these schools which you would recognize across the schools, and which I think attempt to address this challenge that Krishnamurti was laying down about looking. I'll perhaps identify just a few of them, and I'm sure there are many more. First of all, I think all the schools bring in experiences that help children to engage with the outer world, to come upon realities which they might not otherwise in their everyday lives. Let me take one example, and it's an example from the Oak Grove School. And it's something I've seen every year because it involves India as well. Every year, the senior students at Oak Grove School, the grade 12 students, come to India for about 3 weeks. And they spend one of those weeks in Rishi Valley, and so we've been engaging with those children. And I've heard subsequently that these trips to India have been deeply meaningful, in some sense even life-changing for many of the children there. Because they come upon a culture, a reality, a human reality, which is very different from anything they've experienced in their lives in the US. Now, there are experiences of that kind in all of our schools. Our children go out and encounter the world in ways that are new to them. But this kind of experience only becomes meaningful if it's accompanied by a certain inner process as well, a process of reflection and thinking and looking at what that whole experience has been. And I see this happening in all the schools as well. So both an outer engagement with the world and an inner process of reflecting on that engagement. I'll give you another example of this, and this is drawn from Rishi Valley. Every evening in the school, the children sit quietly out on a hillside for about 15 or 20 minutes during the time of sunset. There's no agenda, there's no formal meditation. They don't have to close their eyes or anything. On the contrary, it's a time to just sit outside and look at the extraordinary beauty of the valley around us, to experience its silence, but also perhaps to have that space to look at their own thoughts and so on. So I would say that that kind of space is also in some way designed, again for want of a better word, to facilitate this process, to nurture this process of looking. Now, another, and it's related to this example I just mentioned of sitting out in the evening, is I think children in all the schools are encouraged to, in many ways, to develop a feeling for the natural world, to encounter the natural world at first hand. I know, again, that the Oak Grove children have a very systematic process of going out on hikes, treks, experiencing the outdoor world, on camps, right from when they're very little to when they're in grade 12. And I think in different ways it's true of the other schools as well. So our whole environmental program for the younger children involves a lot of time outdoors, coming into touch with leaves, the sand, and everything that is part of the natural world, and engaging with it. Another thing is, and it links back to what I had said earlier about not only experiencing the world but reflecting on it. I see in these schools a lot of space for dialogue and conversations and self-reflection. And because these experiences in themselves perhaps have little value if there isn't also space to see what they have meant for you, and to also have spaces to look at your own life. Because quiet and beautiful as these schools are, I think it's important to recognize that for the children and adults who go there, they face many of the kinds of problems that we face everywhere. Problems of conflict, problems in human relationship. So how do we meet these problems? So spaces for, again, as I said, conversation, dialogue, reflection seem to be quite central to these schools. And that brings me to a fourth point that I'll just mention, and I'm sure there are many others, which is the primacy of human relationships. I think Krishnamurti, just as he talked a great deal about education, he talked a great deal about relationship, recognizing, as he often put it, that relationship is a mirror through which you see yourself, but also that human relationship is something that one needs to work with, because the past and memories of the past have a way of coming in between. And in those passages I read to you from Freedom from the Known, where he's talking about asking whether you can look at a tree, I'd like to read you one more short passage which has to do with this. He says, "It is only when we see without any preconception, any image, that we are able to be in direct contact with anything in life. All our relationships are really imaginary, that is, based on an image formed by thought. If I have an image about you and you have an image about me, naturally we don't see each other at all as we actually are. What we see is the images we have formed about each other, which prevent us from being in contact, and that is why our relationships go wrong." So here is a whole other domain in which Krishnamurti's insight that being able to look without judgment becomes so central, the whole complex field of human relationships. And I think again in the schools, this is something which is very central, both in terms of having an atmosphere in which students and teachers relate openly, affectionately, I would say profoundly, and explore what right relationship is, and also having a space to understand what he was just talking about in this passage, that what we call relationship might not be relationship at all because of the way images come in the way and so on. So here are some of the things which I'm saying are important to the Krishnamurti schools, which I think arise out of this insight that I've been trying to open out here regarding the importance of looking and attention. So all of this is good and necessary, but I'd like to add a caution here. And it also has to do with something that Jaap said earlier, which is, it's really important that we begin with a question and with recognizing that there's so much we don't know. Having said all this and having said that these are the things which are important to the schools, it seems puzzling that not everyone who goes through our schools comes out free of conflict or living in a state of attention and so on and so forth. For Krishnamurti, the act of looking was looking as action and looking as transformation. When you see something, it ends. Now, the reality, if I look at my own life, is different. I've been in a Krishnamurti school as a student, as a teacher for many, many years. But it's not as if although I've understood these things at a certain level, as if I'm living in, that kind of state of attention in which looking becomes transformative. To give you an illustration of this, and this is a story I'd like to share with you from the Dalai Lama's autobiography, Freedom in Exile. And he talks about this very well-known and remarkable social worker from India, a man called Baba Amte, who dedicated his life to working with lepers, people who suffer from leprosy. And the Dalai Lama speaks about how Baba Amte decided to do this when he was still quite a young man. He was somewhat directionless. He wasn't sure what he wanted to do in life. And one day he was wandering around the streets in his hometown, and he happened to see a leper. And leprosy is a wasting kind of disease. And he saw in that leper's face, where his eye had been, there were maggots eating his skin. He saw that and he knew instantly that he had to do work with lepers, and that changed, that became the defining moment in his life. Now that's seeing as action. He saw something and it was very clear to him what his life needed to be. Now if I look at the reality of my own life, I don't see with that kind of intensity. I'm not sure that all the work we do in our schools necessarily helps our children to acquire that. And yet I do believe that that's the direction in which we need to work. I think there's something in this which makes our lives possibly more wholesome. Now, as I said at the beginning, I'd like to begin with a river and end with a tree. So let me end with a tree. And here there's a passage I'd like to share with you. And this is from Krishnamurti to himself. And this description of the tree that I'd like to read to you, it seems to me both illustrates what looking can be and perhaps also indicates why it is important. There is a tree by the river And we've been watching it day after day for several weeks when the sun is about to rise. As the sun rises slowly over the horizon, over the trees, this particular tree becomes all of a sudden golden. All the leaves are bright with life, and as you watch it as the hours pass by, that tree whose name does not matter, what matters is that beautiful tree. An extraordinary quality seems to spread all over the land, all over the river. And as the sun rises a little higher, the leaves begin to flutter, to dance, and each hour seems to give to that tree a different quality. Before the sun rises, it has a somber feeling, quiet, far away, full of dignity. And as the day begins, the leaves with the light on them dance and give it that peculiar feeling that one has of great beauty. By midday, its shadow has deepened and you can sit there protected from the sun, never feeling lonely, with the tree as your companion. As you sit there, there is a relationship of deep, abiding security and a freedom that only trees can know. Towards the evening, when the western skies are lit up by the setting sun, the tree gradually becomes somber, dark, closing in on itself. The sky has become red, yellow, green, but the tree remains quiet, hidden, and is resting for the night. If you establish a relationship with it, then you have relationship with mankind. You're responsible then for that tree and for the trees of the world. But if you have no relationship with the living things on this earth, you may lose whatever relationship you have with humanity, with human beings. We never look deeply into the quality of a tree. We never really touch it, feel its solidity, its rough bark, and hear the sound that is part of the tree. Not the sound of wind through the leaves, not the breeze of a morning that flutters the leaves, but its own sound, the sound of the trunk and the silent sound of the roots. You must be extraordinarily sensitive to hear the sound. It goes on, but I should perhaps stop there. But just one note, one memory which came to me as I was reading this to you. Once at a school assembly a couple of years ago, I read this passage out, and at the end of it I asked the students, do you think you can hear the sound of the roots of a tree? And everyone was quiet, and one hand shot up. There's one girl, and in fact I should say that her hand shot up as soon as I asked the question. She was absolutely sure, and she had a broad smile on her face, and I think she wasn't fazed one bit that she was the only person who responded that way. So I just wanted to share that with you. So I'll stop here. It's 11:30. I don't know if we have time, if anyone would like to ask some questions or add to anything I've said, please feel free. Yup, do we have a little time? Yeah.
And there's a microphone also.
Yeah.
Yeah. A question.
Yeah.
Just raise your hand and we give you a microphone. There's a microphone because there's also the screening happening. So people who are online can then also follow. Yeah.
You mentioned you would take the students to see the sunset for like 15 to 20 minutes. So I'm just wondering that what do you do with them? Do you ask them questions? Do you just let it happen? They sit there and see the sunset and finish and just go back to school or finish? Or what do you do?
Well, it's for the whole community. It's for students and teachers. And there's no program around it. There's a defined time at which we come and sit there. And then after it's over, we just disperse. So typically, in fact, unlike many of the activities in school, we have bells which tell us what time it is to go to class and so on. For this, we don't even have a bell. Everybody knows that it starts at about 6 o'clock and ends at about 6:20, and the children go from there to class. They have a study hour. And so people just come, sit quietly, and then get up. We don't do anything else specifically around it. Yeah.
Do you see any difference happen when like a certain amount of time that the students going out and
Yeah.
do you see they have close relationship with the nature when
What I've observed is that immediately after that, when children come down, walking back down off the hill, they seem to take a certain quietness with them, without anybody asking them to. Nobody starts speaking for a little while, and then when they do start speaking, they seem to speak softly. It's as if that silence comes into them. But let me also say that not all children are happy to come there. I think some of them find it's yet another thing that they have to do during the day, and they would rather have the time free to just hang out or do whatever else they'd like to do. But what I have noticed is that the older children, once they reach grade 11, grade 12, even more, they seem to value it more and more. And when children leave the school, this is one of the things that they really look back on as having been an important part of their experience. Because you see, India, you know, most of our children after Rishi Valley go to colleges in cities in India. And India's urban environment is very noisy. I remember myself, I was a student in Rishi Valley, and then I went to college in Delhi. And I remember missing that kind of quietness and space. So sometimes children look back on this as having been a very important experience, even when they didn't always enjoy it while it was there. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. I just want to share that I'm a golf coach, so I coach some players, and I have some professionals that when they compete in tournaments,
Right.
they completely forget about the nature.
Uh-huh.
So their minds are so busy about the result, the performance, the scores. So I think that's what you just mentioned. I think will help with with my coach. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Ranjit. I'm from Sri Lanka, and I had an early encounter with Krishnamurti in Sri Lanka. At the time, there's a raging conflict between the Hindus and Buddhists. Each neighbors, a beautiful country, beautiful experience that was being adopted to religious and politicians that had preoccupations. So one of the things that was very profound in his message to me at that time was the freedom from the known. And most of the conditioning that was driving that whole war and the environment were based on influences and untruths. So I came out to Hollywood to create a different story and went into financing entertainment. So I was one of the early adopters of doing that in the early 80s and 90s in the US. Sequence to that was my time I spent up. I bought a home in Ojai, kind of influenced by my good friend Asha and Mark to be more engaged. So today, as we look at the rapid changes going on, the technology industry is changing 300 times faster than the Industrial Revolution. So as the river flows, how do we stay engaged and not necessarily constrained by the thoughts, forms, and conditioning that we are currently imbued with, to go back to being free and being centered in the knowing which Krishnamurti was expressing, that we need to go back, not to listening, but to hearing right from the center of who you are.
I'm not, thank you for sharing that. I'm not sure I've completely understood the question, but I'll try to respond. First, I'm not sure if Krishnamurti was concerned with going back to something, because I'm not sure that he was positing that we are losing a state of quietness that we had. Of course, he was concerned with the kinds of changes you were speaking about, technology, the world moving much faster, and I think even more so now after Krishnamurti's death, we are now contending with, social media, the immediacy of electronic communication, and all of this has a profound effect on, I think, the way we think and on the way children think. So the challenge is, how do we retain a space for the other thing through all of this, to be able to reflect, to learn about looking, to learn about attention, because of course without that, and to take your own example of the conflict in Sri Lanka, which arises out of a deep social conditioning, without that kind of space, how do we even begin to deal with conflict? Because I think what Krishnamurti understood was that war does not solve conflict. The ending of conflict can only perhaps happen when you begin to see the conditioning that's given rise to that conflict. And to see that conditioning requires time, requires a slowing down, whereas the technological world is pushing us in the opposite direction. So we have our work cut out, and I think I don't think it's impossible for the schools to create that kind of space, and hopefully the children who've experienced the value of that will carry it with them, will retain a sense of space and freedom in their lives even when they're outside the Krishnamurti schools.
Thank you. Now you mentioned something that immediately connects with my next question. Do you have any kind of program or way to follow up the students, like if they come back and tells you their experience in the real world or outside, or how they manage their conflict when they go to real college or their own lives?
Yeah. I can only speak about Rishi Valley. I'm not sure about the other schools. We don't have a formal program by which we are following up the lives of all the children after they leave school, but we have a fairly good sense, because many of them do remain in touch with the school, typically with individual teachers whom they have been close to, but they also like to visit the school. And when they visit the school, they're in touch with us. They come to our homes and they talk about their lives. They talk about the kinds of challenges they faced, and it's not always easy for some of them. It takes some of them a little while to adjust. But there's this whole question about the difference between the worlds of these schools and the so-called outer world, as if Rishi Valley or the other schools were some kind of protective bubbles, and the reality out there is something very different. I don't find that a helpful way of thinking, and I don't think it reflects reality actually. In some sense, any school is a protected space and needs to be, because children need a certain space and freedom, and not to have to worry about certain things, in order that their energies can be channelized in towards learning and growth and all of that. So in some sense, as I said, that's true of any school. But then, one is learning, fundamentally one is learning about meeting life. And it seems to me that the real challenges that children are going to face are not terribly different from the challenges we face as adults. And the challenges really are the inner challenges of relationship, of conflict, of being trapped in the little cocoons one creates around oneself. In fact, another of the questions that I remember Krishnamurti asking again, because he asked it so concretely, was, you create a wall around yourself. And as a child, I remember imagining that very vividly. Yes, a wall around myself. And what is this wall? What does this wall consist of? And of course, as I grew older, I began to understand what he was talking about. It's this whole protective mechanism which comes from one's past and so on. So that's there, you have the space to begin to look at that even when you're in the school, and it stays with you even after you leave school. So I think the real challenges are at that level. And they're not terribly different whether you're in school or outside, or whether you're a child or an adult. There are other transitional challenges, because of course, especially as I said, in India, there are all kinds of challenges living in a city, public transport, learning how to handle money, all of those things. And those can also, take some time to get used to. But those are relatively small. And I think the kids take those on board quite quickly. But the real challenges remain. And what we hope is that while they are in these schools, they begin to see that these challenges are the real ones. And these are the ones that they will have to live with all through their lives. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I guess my question is how, as an educator in literature, you address the question of perception looking through that medium, because literature is so referential and so based on naming the thing or having a metaphor for the thing or abstracting the thing, and yet through teaching it, how can that be a vehicle for looking more closely? And I feel like Krishnamurti is always talking to that, like, take that space as an educator to encourage that looking, and I'm curious how you've experienced it as a teacher.
Yeah. I think actually literature is a great context in which to learn about looking. Of course, as you said, literature is referential, has a lot of background which you perhaps need. There's a lot of information and labeling which can become part of the study of literature. But I think there's another side to it which has, and I think that's the primary one, which has to do with allowing yourself the space to respond to a text, to what a text seems to be saying, even before you know much about it. And then learning how to examine your own responses. So if you take a poem, for example, and you don't know anything about it, you don't know who wrote it, you don't know the context, but you have the words, you can learn in a class to read the words, you can develop the tools to understand how those words work together to produce meaning, and you respond to that meaning. But also, as I said, the next thing, which is also you have the space to look at your own responses. So I think students usually respond very strongly to texts. They immediately know whether they like a text or it makes them feel uncomfortable or whatever. And I think those responses are extremely valuable, because those responses are gateways into understanding something about yourself. So I see that the study of literature can really feed into this process of beginning to see something about yourself. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Please.
Hi. In one of the passages that I read,
Yeah.
it was mentioned that Krishnamurti asked the student to observe the thoughts as it arises and then find out like why it came out. So I'm just wondering, it may not be analysis, but what could it be? Like what was he indicating? Meaning like perhaps he's not asking the student to meaning do analysis on why this thought came, and again there are more thoughts again, right?
Yeah.
So what could be the meaning of that one?
Yeah, I think the question you're asking, I mean, it's something I've been deeply interested in also. What does it mean to look at a thought and to look at it fully? He says, look at it completely, understand where it's coming from. And some people feel that analysis comes in the way of that looking. I don't know. I mean, I have mixed feelings about analysis because I see it as a very useful tool, and even in, for example, the study of literature. And I think it would be reductive to think of analysis as being a purely cerebral process and looking as being something that's pure and free of analysis. That there's sometimes a tendency to separate these two. And there may be something in that separation, but I'm not sure how far it is valid. If I look at the way I think and the way I look, I find it quite hard to separate the two. Now, when he's asking this question to students, he certainly uses the word look, see where it's coming from. But I think Krishnamurti, as with a lot of his vocabulary, he uses words in somewhat distinctive and unique ways. And whether or not that seeing is something which is separate from thought and understanding and cognition, I don't know. I mean, it's a question that interests me, but I don't think I can throw any light on it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to clarify what you were saying earlier about looking without judgment. You hear this a lot around, particularly Ojai, don't be judgmental, so forth.
Yeah.
I find it frequently as a kind of a lazy excuse to not make good discretion.
Right.
So certainly in classical Indian thought, you have the three gunas, goodness, passion, and ignorance, and they seem to be very helpful. So I'm trying to understand, when you're teaching the children, how do you actually teach them? I mean, in terms of, obviously, when they're let loose in the world, for example, I was taught as a child, don't get in a car with a stranger. There's a reason for that.
Yes.
So it's not as if we should go into the world just blindly being non-judgmental. There has to be discretion. We use it all the time.
Yes.
So I'd like you to elaborate on just exactly how the application of that when you say looking without judgment. It opens the doors for people to just be totally irresponsible.
Yes.
I see that a lot.
Yes. Yeah. Maybe I'll try to address your question a little bit indirectly by referring again to the way one might approach poetry. Now, when you are reading a poem and studying it and trying to understand it, that's a process which involves, after that initial response and looking at response, there's certainly a sharp cognitive process that's part of it, which involves judgment, which involves evaluation, analysis, and all of that. And it seems to me that that's perhaps unavoidable. And perhaps it's unavoidable even in the area of human relationships. I mean, you are in some sense judging people, and perhaps there's some need for that even for, well, one's self-preservation or whatever. I think the challenge might be, I'm not saying this is what Krishnamurti is saying, I'm just responding to your question. The challenge might be to at least be aware that one is using a process of judgment, and to also hold that judgment with a quality of lightness and tentativeness, so that the judgment is open to being revised from moment to moment as you have evidence that might require you to change it. I think, to me, the problem is not so much judgment or analysis per se, but the strength with which we tend to hold these. And that, I think that's linked to, Krishnamurti's insight that the past has such a strong hold on the way we live. The past can't be wished away, memory can't be wished away, it's there, and it's necessary, you can't live without it. But the interesting thing is that it seems to occupy so much space in one's mind. And I think that's what he was perhaps pointing at. And maybe there's something there that can be shaken through this process of looking and attention, because when the mind is in that state of attention, it's perhaps less held, let us put it that way, by memory and judgment. I don't know if that addresses your question, but yeah. Okay, yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about Krishnamurti's work outside of the Krishnamurti schools and where he's influencing education, maybe in universities or in science or places like that? I'd like to hear your point of view about that.
Yeah. I'm not sure that I'm the best person to answer that question. I don't know if I know enough about it. But there are two levels. One is what is his actual presence today in the world of education apart from the Krishnamurti schools? Is he recognized? Is he considered a serious thinker? Do educationists take his views seriously and all of that? I think there are some signs that he is. I know in India, in some education curricula, there are readings from Krishnamurti and so on. So it looks as if he's sort of being drawn into what you might call more mainstream thinking in the field of education as well. But aside from all that, and I also do know that Krishnamurti had intense conversations with a number of people, including in the fields, including scientists, philosophers, and so on, all of whom seemed to find some importance in what he was speaking about. So in that way too, I would say his presence exists outside the Krishnamurti schools. Having said all that, and that's one part of it, what is his actual presence today? What is the strength of his legacy? It seems to me that, what we've been talking about today, this process of looking really is so important to living sanely in this world that I think it's worth exploring in everybody's lives if they're interested in it. In fact, I don't see how, if you look at the kinds of problems we face globally, right? The various forms of environmental damage that we are doing, for example, so much of it has to do with lifestyles that are mindless. And when I say mindless, I don't mean that in a pejorative way. What I mean is absence of mind. I mean, we seem to fall into certain patterns of living and therefore consumption without seeing the connections between that and the well-being of the planet and of other people and so on. So I think Krishnamurti offers us something here, which is the tools of looking, both at the outer and inward, and seeing that they're really one kind of looking. And I think that's vital for, for the future of the planet, for the future of all of us, which might sound like a somewhat vague response, but I do genuinely think it's really essential. I don't see any alternative.
I've been studying the teachings for quite a few years, and it's helped my life a lot. I feel like I'm less my prejudices have left, and I have more sensitive to nature and everything. It's just I don't feel like I have that deep quality of silence and that what Krishnamurti talked about flowering, and I don't know. I'm at the point where I don't know if I should just give up or just keep looking, like you say, looking, because we're all students. Really, it's just we're talking about children, but we're all students of this teaching.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to kind of see what your thoughts on that.
No, I'm in exactly the same position as you are. I think there are ways in which my life has been touched by coming into contact with Krishnamurti, but I don't know how much I've changed. I don't know how silent my mind is. I know it often is very unsilent and all of that. But I think there's value even in just seeing that and recognizing it to be the truth. And maybe over time what happens is that becomes less of a problem. I'd just like to share a small experience with you. For some years I was working in a small rural school in the Himalayan foothills where we also ran a retreat for people to stay quietly. And during one vacation, I decided to stay myself at the retreat, which was a few kilometers away, and to be alone there for about a week or so. I was just curious about what I would experience, and I chose not to take anything to read with me. I just wanted to put myself in an unknown situation and see what it did. And I found the first few days were very difficult because not only was my mind not quiet as perhaps somewhere I thought it would, I thought my mind would quieten, it didn't. But I also found that it was even more noisy than usual because there were so many reactions to the fact that it wasn't quiet. And that was adding to the noise. Now, however, after a few days, what I found was the mind was still chattering a lot, but the reactions began to die down. And it was as if I was able to see that my mind was not quiet and it was less of a problem. That was the reality. And I think, I don't know if Krishnamurti would have seen this as good enough. He was pushing very hard. But at least that's a start.
Yeah, I think we expect a result.
Yes.
We want to know, and we really can't know that.
Yes.
Yeah. It's part of it.
And I think then we are trapped in the same loop, isn't it? Because it's an expectation based on knowledge. Somebody has talked about something, and then you're reacting because you're not there. Yeah.
One more question, and then it's time.
Sir, sorry to throw another question to you.
Yeah.
but is it possible to together? What is the question? So, what is the question? Because life seems to be so much full of question in the man's brain. And what is the right question?
Are you asking me for an answer?
Well, no, not answer, but as I
Okay,
said at the beginning,
Okay.
can we look together?
I think, to me, what I think you're calling the right question is when a question is real. When you read Krishnamurti or whoever, you encounter people who've thought a great deal about things, and that can be very compelling. And you can find that you're beginning to adopt their questions as your own. And they might not really be your questions. So I think one of the challenges is exactly what you're asking, to find out what one's question deeply is. The title of the book I read some of the passages from was Freedom from the Known. What is it to be free from the known? Is a question which arises even verbally from the title. But that may or may not be my deepest question. So I think what is given to me is to at least be aware of, to try and be aware of the fact that some question might not be my authentic question. It might be an influenced question. It might be because somebody else has asked it and because I respect that person. So discovering what one's own questions are is, I think, maybe a lifelong task. Okay? Should we stop? Thank you. Thank you very much.